The dining room of Harlow and Finch, one of the most exclusive restaurants in downtown Toronto, smelled of white truffle and fresh-cut lilies on the evening that everything changed. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling, painted the color of old cream. The tables were draped in linen so white it seemed to glow under the low amber light. Every chair was occupied by someone who had paid $300 a plate for the privilege of being seen here, and they sat with the practiced stillness of people who believed that silence, when purchased at the right price, was the truest form of luxury. It was into this precise and careful world that Edith Calloway walked, alone, at 8 on a Friday evening in late November. She was 79 years old. Her white hair was cut short and neat, brushed back from her forehead in a way that suggested she had stopped worrying about fashion a long time ago. She wore a long navy cardigan over a plain cotton dress, and her shoes were flat and sensible, the kind a woman buys when she has decided that comfort matters more than compliments. She carried no handbag, only a small folded reservation card in her left hand and a wool scarf draped across her arm that had been washed so many times its pattern had faded to a ghost of itself. She walked to the host stand and waited. Julian Thorne saw her before she reached the podium. He was 35, the maître d' of Harlow and Finch, appointed to the role 18 months ago after a decade spent climbing through the city's restaurant scene with the particular ambition of a man who believed that proximity to wealth was the same thing as possessing it. His suit was charcoal, Italian cut, fitted so precisely that it seemed to have opinions of its own. His dark hair was parted with geometric care. He had a habit of smiling at guests with only the lower half of his face, and the smile he produced now as Edith reached the stand was the version he kept for situations he intended to end quickly. "Good evening," he said. "Do you have a reservation?" Edith held up the small card. "Calloway," she said. 8 o'clock. Table for one. Julian did not look at the card. He looked at the cardigan, the cotton dress, the flat shoes, and the scarf that had been washed into near transparency. He tilted his head the way a man tilts his head when he has already made a decision but wants the other person to believe he is still thinking. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the couple nearest the entrance to hear. "We do have a dress code at Harlow and Finch. I'm afraid this evening's attire may not meet our dining room standards. Perhaps I could recommend somewhere more casual nearby?" Edith did not flinch. She placed the reservation card flat on the podium and tapped it once with her finger. "I made this reservation 3 weeks ago," she said. "I confirmed it this morning by telephone. The young woman I spoke with did not mention a dress code. It is understood," Julian said smoothly. "Our regular guests are familiar with our expectations." The implication was neat and deliberate. "You are not a regular guest. You do not understand our world." The couple near the entrance exchanged a glance. A woman in a red silk dress at a nearby table set down her wine glass and watched with the mild interest of someone observing a small disturbance that would not affect her evening. At a round table near the back of the dining room, partially hidden by a tall arrangement of white orchids, sat Duncan Price. He was 58 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way that years of physical labor leaves a man even after the labor has ended. His hands were large and scarred in places, the left one still marked by a burn from a warehouse fire in Scarborough, 22 years ago. He had been a firefighter with Toronto Fire Services for 31 years before a back injury had forced his retirement at 55. His dark hair had gone gray at the temples. He wore a navy blazer that his daughter had bought him for this evening, and he had put it on without complaint, though the collar felt stiff against his neck and the buttons were smaller than his fingers preferred. Duncan was here because his daughter, Maren Price, had insisted. Maren was 29, a junior partner at one of the city's most prominent corporate law firms. She sat across from him now in a fitted black dress, her brown hair pulled back, her posture the kind of straight that comes from years spent in boardrooms where slouching was interpreted as weakness. Maren loved her father deeply, but she had spent the last several years trying to teach him how to exist in spaces that made him uncomfortable, and she was not always gentle about it. She had chosen this restaurant because her firm's managing partner dined here on Fridays, and she wanted him to see her with family, composed and belonging. In a place like this. She had not told her father that part. Beside Marin sat her Duncan's grandson, a boy of 6 named Theo, who was drawing a fire truck on the back of the dessert menu with a crayon he had smuggled in his coat pocket. Duncan had been raising Theo since Marin's husband had left 2 years ago. Marin worked 70-hour weeks. Duncan picked Theo up from school, made his lunches, helped with his reading, sat beside him on nights when the boy woke up frightened and asking where his father had gone. Duncan never told the boy that his father was not coming back. He only said that sometimes people need to go away for a while, and that the people who stay are the ones who matter most. Duncan heard the commotion at the front of the restaurant before he saw it. He heard the particular quality of a voice being kept low and polite while meaning something cruel. He set down his water glass and looked toward the entrance. He saw a woman. He saw the reservation card flat on the podium. He saw the maître d's tilted head and the practiced half-smile. He understood the scene in the way that a man who has spent his life entering burning buildings understands danger. Not from analysis, but from the feeling in his chest. "What's happening up there?" he said quietly. Marin glanced toward the entrance. She took in the situation with the rapid, trained assessment of a lawyer and looked back at her menu. "Probably just a mix-up with a booking, Dad. Let them sort it out." Duncan watched a moment longer. Edith Calloway was still standing at the podium. She had not moved. She had not raised her voice. Her left hand, the one holding the scarf, had begun to tremble very slightly, and Duncan noticed it the way he had once noticed the first thin curl of smoke beneath a closed door. Julian Thorne was speaking again. He had not taken the reservation card from the podium. He had not checked the screen beside him. He had not typed the name into the system. The verification would have taken 5 seconds. He chose, instead, to keep the old woman standing. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I want to be respectful of your evening. But our dining room has certain standards that our guests rely on us to maintain. I'm sure you understand." "I understand," Edith said quietly, "that I have a reservation, and you have not checked it." A waiter, carrying a tray of champagne flutes, paused near the podium, looked at the scene, and then continued walking, as though he had seen nothing. A man in a gray suit near the bar turned his back. The woman in the red silk dress returned to her wine. This was how it always worked. Not with a single act of cruelty, but with the slow, cooperative silence of everyone nearby. Duncan pushed his chair back. Marin's hand shot across the table and caught his wrist. "Dad," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Don't. That woman has a reservation," Duncan said. "You don't know that. She's holding it in her hand." Marin leaned closer. Her eyes moved briefly to a table near the window where a silver-haired man in a perfectly tailored suit was eating alone. Duncan did not know the man. Marin did. He was the managing partner of her firm. He was the reason she had chosen this restaurant tonight. He was the reason she had bought her father the blazer. "Dad," she said again. "Please, not tonight." Duncan looked at his daughter. He looked at the careful way she held her shoulders, the stiffness in her smile, the way her eyes kept moving toward the man by the window. He recognized the architecture of her fear because he had watched her build it, brick by brick. Over the years since she had begun climbing into rooms where people like him were not usually welcome. He did not blame her. He only remembered, with a sadness that settled into his chest like an old ache, that he had once told a much younger Marin, on a winter morning when she had refused to sit with a new girl at school because the girl's coat was torn, that the measure of a person was never what they did when everyone was watching. It was what they did when no one wanted them to. He stood up. "Dad," Marin whispered. He walked past the orchids, past 2 tables of diners who did not look up, past the waiter who had chosen not to see, and he stopped beside Edith Calloway at the podium. He did not touch her. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood close enough that she could feel another person beside her, the way a wall of sandbags feels to someone standing in rising water. Then he turned to Julian Thorne. "She has a reservation," he said. "Check it." Julian's eyes moved from Duncan's face to his blazer to his scarred hands to the slightly uneven knot of his tie. The assessment took less than a second. Julian produced the same half-smile he had been wearing all evening. "Sir, this is a private matter between the restaurant and this guest. I appreciate your concern, but I would ask you to return to your table. It stopped being private when you made her stand here long enough for the whole room to watch, Duncan said. Check the reservation. It will take you 5 seconds. Edith turned to him. Her eyes were pale blue, very clear, and there was something in them that was not quite gratitude and not quite sorrow, but something older than both. You don't need to do this, she said softly. I can go somewhere else. You shouldn't have to, Duncan said. Julian straightened. His smile disappeared. What replaced it was the expression of a man who has decided to stop pretending. Sir, he said, Harlow and Finch reserves the right to refuse service at management's discretion. This is not a matter of a reservation. It is a matter of the dining experience we are obligated to provide our guests. Your guest, Duncan said, nodding toward Edith, is standing right in front of you. Our seated guests, Julian corrected. The ones who have already been welcomed. The distinction was so clean and so cruel that it silenced the nearest tables. A man in a cashmere sweater looked down at his plate. A young couple near the bar pretended to study the cocktail menu. Maren appeared at her father's side. She had left Theo at the table with his crayons and walked the length of the dining room with the measured pace of a woman trying to control a situation she could feel slipping away. She placed her hand on Duncan's arm. Dad, she said, keeping her voice beneath the hearing of the nearby tables. I know this feels wrong, but this is not our fight. We don't know the full story. Duncan looked at her. His expression was patient, but there was a weight behind it. Maren, he said, you're a lawyer. You know exactly what the full story is. A woman with a reservation is being turned away because of how she looks. You're making assumptions. I'm making observations. There is a difference. Julian seized the opening. He turned to Maren with the smooth deference of a man who recognized professional clothing and adjusted his strategy accordingly. Ma'am, thank you for your understanding. I assure you this is simply a matter of policy. Your evening will not be disrupted further. It was the word disrupted that did something to the room. It compressed everything that had been happening into a single idea. The old woman was a disruption. The man defending her was a disruption. The only way to restore order was to make them both disappear. Maren felt it. She felt it in the way her own professional language had been turned inside out and handed back to her. Policy, discretion, standards, guest experience. She had used every one of those words in contracts and negotiations. She knew what they meant when they were pointed at a person instead of a page. She looked at her father. What do you want me to do? She asked. And for the first time that evening, her voice was not a lawyer's voice. It was a daughter's. I want you to watch, Duncan said simply, and then decide for yourself. Julian had turned his attention back to Edith. His voice had dropped into a register of false kindness. Mrs. Calloway, I don't want this to become unpleasant. Let me call you a taxi. There are several lovely bistros on Queen Street that would be happy to. I did not come to Queen Street, Edith said. Her voice was very quiet, but there was something in it now that had not been there before. A stillness. I came here. I came to this restaurant. On this night. For a reason. She paused. She looked at the dining room, at the chandeliers and the white linen and the orchids and the faces turned half away, and then she continued. My husband and I used to walk past this building every Saturday evening for 43 years. It was a hardware store when we were first married. Then it became a bookshop. Then it closed for a long time. When it opened as a restaurant, my husband said that one day, when the children were grown and the house was paid for, and the years had been kind, he would bring me here and we would sit at a table by the window and eat something we could not pronounce and laugh about it afterward. She touched the scarf on her arm. He died 14 months ago. Tonight is his birthday. I came to keep his promise. The dining room had gone very still, not the polished silence of money. A different silence, kind. That happens when a room full of people suddenly realizes that the story they thought they were watching is not the story that is being told. Julian opened his mouth. For a moment it seemed as though the story might have reached him. But the machinery of his pride was already turning, and what came out was the sentence that broke something irreparable in the room. Mrs. Calloway, he said, that is a lovely story. A sentimental reason for dining does not change the standards of the restaurant. Duncan's hands, which had been resting at his sides, closed slowly into fists. Not the fists of a man about to strike someone. The fists of a man holding himself still when every instinct was telling him to move. You just told a 79-year-old woman, he said very slowly, that her dead husband's birthday is not a good enough reason to eat dinner. Several people in the dining room set down their forks. The man in the cashmere sweater pushed his plate away as though he had lost his appetite. The young couple at the bar turned to watch openly. Julian's face tightened. He had lost control of the room and he knew it. He reached for the only tool he had left. He raised his hand and signaled toward the back of the restaurant. A man in a dark suit emerged from the office corridor. He was tall, heavy-set, with the blank expression of someone whose job was to end situations without creating scenes. Private security. The kind of man restaurants like this hired to solve problems that politeness could not. "Sir," Julian said, turning to Duncan, "I have asked you repeatedly to return to your table. If you are unable to do so, I will have no choice but to ask you to leave the premises." Marin stepped forward. The calculating part of her mind was screaming. The managing partner was 15 meters away. Every person in this room would remember this. Her career, the partnership she had spent 6 years building toward, the reputation she had polished until it shone like the chrome on the chandeliers above her, all of it was standing on the edge of a very public cliff, but her father was looking at the old woman. And the old woman was pressing her hand against her chest the way people do when something hurts in a place that medicine cannot reach. And Marin heard, as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud, her father's voice from 23 years ago. The measure of a person is never what they do when everyone is watching. It is what they do when no one wants them to. Marin turned to Julian. "Check the reservation," she said. Her voice was clear and level and carried across 3 tables. "Right now." Julian stared at her. "Ma'am, my name is Marin Price. I am a partner at Alderman, Keating & Lowe. And if you remove a 79-year-old woman from this restaurant without verifying her confirmed reservation, I will file a human rights complaint with the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal by Monday morning, and I will make sure the details reach every food editor and restaurant critic in this city by Tuesday." The room went very quiet. Not the silence of discomfort, the silence of attention. Julian looked at the security man. The security man looked at Julian. Neither of them moved. Then a voice came from the back of the dining room. It was calm, female, and carried the particular authority of someone who does not need to raise her voice because she has never had to. "Julian." A woman in her early 60s stepped out from a private dining alcove near the kitchen. She wore a simple gray linen suit. Her hair was silver blonde, cut to her jaw. She carried no jewelry except a thin platinum watch. She had been sitting behind the frosted glass partition, and she had heard everything. Her name was Astrid Pennington. She was the owner of the building that housed Harlow and Finch. She was also the owner of 17 other commercial properties on this block, the founder of the Pennington Trust, the largest private charitable foundation in Ontario, and, according to the most recent published estimate, the 4th wealthiest woman in Canada. She was also Edith Calloway's daughter. She walked past the security man without looking at him. She walked past Julian without speaking to him. She stopped in front of her mother and took the old woman's hands in both of hers. "Mum," she said softly, "I'm sorry I was late." Edith smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was real. "I told you I could manage on my own, Astrid." Astrid turned to Julian. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Every person in the room had already understood what was happening, but Astrid spoke anyway, not for her own sake, but for the sake of every person listening who needed to hear it said aloud. "This is my mother," she said. "She owns the building you are standing in. She owns the land beneath it. She has owned it for 31 years. The hardware store that was here before? That was my father's business. The bookshop after that? My mother ran it for 12 years after he retired." She paused. "Wait." The scarf she is carrying was a gift from my father on their first anniversary. The dress she is wearing is the dress she wore to their last dinner together. She did not come here tonight to impress you. She came to sit in the place where my father built something with his hands and eat a meal in his memory. And you told her she was not dressed well enough. Julian's face had gone the particular shade of white that comes when a man sees the entire structure of his authority collapse in a single moment. His mouth opened. The word that came out was procedure, and it died in the air between them like a match in a rainstorm. Astrid looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then she turned to the room. "My mother did not accidentally recognize tonight," she said. "She did not bring security. She did not mention her name. She wanted to walk in like anyone else and be treated the way anyone should be treated." She paused, and she would have been turned away if it were not for this man. She looked at Duncan. Duncan shook his head slightly. "I didn't know who she was. I still don't think it matters." "It doesn't," Astrid said. "That is exactly the point." She turned back to Julian. "You are relieved of your duties effective immediately. Please collect your belongings." Julian did not argue. He walked toward the back of the restaurant without looking at any of the guests. The security man followed him and neither of them spoke. The room exhaled. Edith reached out and touched Duncan's arm. Her hand was small and light and very steady. "What is your name?" she asked. "Duncan Price, ma'am." "Mr. Price," she said. "There were 46 people in this dining room. 45 of them looked at me and saw a woman who did not belong. You saw a woman who needed someone to stand beside her." Duncan looked uncomfortable with the praise. He shifted his weight the way large men do when they want to become smaller. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said quietly. "If that were true, I would not have been standing alone." It was the same truth, spoken in different words, that the room could not argue with. Marin stood a step behind her father. Her shoulders had dropped. The stiffness in her posture, the architecture of control she had spent years perfecting, had quietly collapsed, and what was left was something simpler and more honest. She looked like a woman who had just remembered something she had spent a long time trying to forget. She stepped forward. She did not speak to Edith or to Astrid. She spoke to her father. "I almost stopped you," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "I was thinking about the managing partner at the table by the window. I was thinking about how this would look. I was calculating." Duncan put his hand on her shoulder. He did not squeeze. He just rested it there. "You stopped calculating," he said. "That is the part that matters. And you raised me better than I was acting tonight." Duncan smiled very slightly. "I raised you to walk into rooms like this. I only hoped that once you got in, you wouldn't forget how to see the people being pushed out of them." Marin pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. She did not cry because she had trained herself not to cry in public spaces, but she nodded once, and the nod carried the weight of everything she could not say. Theo appeared beside them. He had walked the length of the dining room by himself, his crayon drawing of a fire truck clutched in one hand. He looked up at Edith with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a 6-year-old. "Are you okay?" he asked. Edith looked down at him. Something in her face softened in a way that it had not softened all evening. "I am now, sweetheart," she said. "Thank you for asking." Theo held out the drawing. "This is for you," he said. "It's a fire truck. My grandpa used to drive one." Edith took the drawing carefully as though it were something fragile and important. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked at Duncan, and something passed between them that the rest of the room could not hear. It was the recognition of two people who had spent their lives loving others without asking for anything in return, and who understood in that single exchanged glance that they were the same kind of person. Astrid invited Duncan, Marin, and Theo to join Edith at her table. They ate together by the window. At the table where Edith's husband had always said they would one day sit, the conversation was quiet and unhurried. Edith told them about her husband, Walter, who had run the hardware store for 34 years and who had known the name of every customer who walked through the door. She told them about the Saturday walks, about the way Walter would stop outside the building and say, "One day, Edie, one day we will eat in there, and I will order something I cannot pronounce, and you will laugh at me, and it will be perfect." Duncan told her about the firehouse, about the men he had worked with, about the morning he had carried a child out of a burning apartment on Dundas Street, and how the child's mother had grabbed his hand at the hospital and held it for 45 minutes without saying a single word. He told her that sometimes the most important things were the things nobody said. When the meal ended, Astrid walked them to the door. She stopped Duncan before he stepped outside. "Mr. Price," she said, "my family's foundation funds programs for children in underserved communities. We have been looking for someone to lead our new mentorship initiative in Scarborough, someone who understands what it means to show up for people when it is easier not to." Duncan looked at her. "I'm a retired firefighter," he said. "I don't know anything about foundations." "You know how to walk into a room and make it better," she said. "That is not something I can teach." In the weeks that followed, Harlow and Finch issued a public statement acknowledging the incident. The restaurant implemented mandatory training on discriminatory service practices. An anonymous review of 5 years of reservation records revealed 14 documented complaints from guests who had been discouraged from dining based on appearance. Each complainant received a personal apology and an invitation to return. Maren Price did not lose her partnership. The managing partner at the table by the window had seen the entire exchange. On Monday morning, he called her into his office. She expected a reprimand. Instead, he told her that in 28 years of practicing law, he had rarely seen someone choose integrity over calculation in real time, and that the firm needed more people who understood that the two were not supposed to be in conflict. Maren went home that evening and sat on the floor of Theo's bedroom while Duncan read the boy a story. Wait. She leaned her head against the doorframe and watched her father do the thing he had always done best. Be present for someone who needed him. She thought about all the dinners where she had asked him to wear a different jacket. All the times she had corrected his grammar or winced when he told a story about the firehouse at one of her firm events. She thought about how hard she had worked to build a life that looked right from the outside, and how close she had come to letting it make her small on the inside. After Theo fell asleep, she sat with her father in the kitchen. He was drinking tea from the same mug he had used for 15 years. She told him she was sorry, not for one night, but for years of small corrections and quiet embarrassments that she had dressed up as love. Duncan set down his mug. He did not look hurt. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with the steady, unshakable certainty that she was capable of being exactly the person he had raised her to be. "You don't need to be sorry," he said. "You needed to climb. I understand climbing. I just didn't want you to forget the ground." On a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks later, Duncan took Theo to visit Edith Calloway at her home. It was a modest brick house in East York, the same house she and Walter had lived in for 51 years. The living room was filled with books and photographs, and a large worn armchair that had clearly belonged to someone who was no longer there. Edith served them tea and shortbread. Theo sat on the floor and drew pictures of fire trucks, while Duncan and Edith talked about their lives the way two people talk, when they have already decided to trust each other. She told him she had never wanted the money. It had come from the land, from the city growing around properties Walter had bought decades ago, with money saved from the hardware store. She had kept the small house because it was where they had argued about bills, and danced in the kitchen and raised 2 daughters, and buried a dog named Humphrey in the backyard under the maple tree. "People think wealth changes who you are," she said. "It does not. It only changes who will stand beside you, and more importantly, who will not." Duncan understood. He had watched it happen with Maren. The higher she climbed, the harder it became for her to see the ground. It was not her fault. It was the nature of high places. They narrow the view. But on that Friday night at Harlow and Finch, standing beside an old woman in a faded scarf, he had watched his daughter's view widen again. And that, more than any meal or any job or any partnership, was the thing he would carry for the rest of his life. Edith picked up Theo's drawing from the table. The fire truck was bright red with oversized wheels and a ladder that bent at an impossible angle. She studied it with the same seriousness she might have given a legal document. "This is a very fine truck," she said to the boy. "Grandpa drove a real one," Theo said. "I know," Edith said. She looked at Duncan. "And I suspect he drove it the way he does everything else, straight toward the fire, while everyone else was running the other direction." Duncan smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that costs nothing and means everything. A first-class meal can be purchased with money. A reservation can be made with a phone call. A designer suit can be fitted in an afternoon, but the willingness to stand beside a stranger when the room has decided she does not belong, that cannot be bought, it cannot be tailored, and it cannot be taught by any training program in the world. It can only be lived, one quiet decision at a time, by the kind of person who has always understood that the most important thing you can offer another human being is not your wealth or your name or your silence. It is your presence freely given in the moment when presence is the hardest thing to give.